You listen to this podcast for incisive coverage of the tech, business, and market forces shaping clean energy and climate tech. You can get them in your inbox, too. Latitude Media's flagship newsletter, The Latitude, offers B2B analysis, commentary, and curated news from across the industry. It's the perfect complement to this show. Subscribe to receive The Latitude daily or weekly in your inbox, or get our AI Energy Nexus newsletter on Wednesdays. Go to latitudemedia.com/newsletter to subscribe today.
Latitude Media, podcast at the frontier of climate technology.
I'm Shayle Kann, and this is Catalyst.
When people say, oh, these data centers are bringing back coal or whatever, like there are opportunities to actually make these data centers some of the most, sort of clean-powered industrial loads in the country, and to do it at costs that are actually probably the most competitive.
Coming up, when and how it makes sense to co-locate power generation with data centers.
The electric grid is changing. Utilities need smarter solutions to balance supply and demand, especially as they face growing renewables and electrification. With Energy Hub, utilities can manage all of their customers' connected devices, like batteries, EVs, and smart thermostats, in one platform to grow their virtual power plants and seamlessly shape electricity demand. Unlock the power of flexibility at scale and deliver more value through cross-DER dispatch with Energy Hub, the leading edge DERMS provider. Visit energyhub.com to learn more.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the communications and marketing partner for mission-driven organizations developing and adopting climate solutions. Their team of experts help businesses like yours identify, refine, and amplify your authentic climate story. With over 3 decades of experience as a growth partner to the most consequential brands in the industry, their team is ready to make an impact on day one. Get started today at antennagroup.com.
I'm Shayle Kann. I invest in revolutionary climate technologies at Energy Impact Partners. Welcome. All right, so here's the operative question of the moment. How exactly are we going to power the tens of gigawatts of data centers that are in development or in planning or in major proclamations, including presidents and Masa from SoftBank and so on? One thing that is clearly happening to answer that question is a mad dash to identify any sites where the grid already has enough excess capacity today to fit a few hundred megawatts of load or a gigawatt or multiple gigawatts of new load. So that's happening. A second thing that's happening is a close examination of every opportunity to add a lot of new capacity in one location to the grid, be that through nuclear, see 3 Mile Island as an example, or renewables or gas. But a third thing that's starting to happen more and more is the idea of building behind the meter or on-site or co-located generation at the site of these data centers. A lot of this to date that has been announced is natural gas. This, for example, is how xAI is partially powering its rapidly built data center in Memphis. But lots more similar announcements with new natural gas have arrived. But here's a question that hasn't been as prominent, I think, until recently. What about solar or wind or storage? Will we see significant amounts of on-site renewables at data centers? And if so, then there's a cascade of questions that come after that. Will the data centers be grid connected or off grid? How should we think about the load profile, et cetera? So it was cool to see an announcement in December from Intersect Power, which is a leading renewables IPP and is led by my friend Sheldon Kimber. Intersect partnered with TPG, which is a big investment firm, and Google on a partnership that initially will inject about $800 million into Intersect to develop solar and storage and wind and some gas co-located with data centers in the United States. There's lots to dig into on that. And beyond that specific topic, it's also an opportunity for us to get an update from Sheldon on what's going on in the solar and storage markets more generally, because things are, as always, in motion. Anyway, here's Sheldon. Sheldon, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be back.
How many times a day do you think you say the term data centers right now?
Probably more than I'd like, to be honest. It's a moment in time where I think you have the kind of curse and the blessing of, in the power sector for many years, we've wanted the world to pay attention to us. We've been the most boring people at cocktail parties. And now all of a sudden, the world is paying attention to us. And we're learning what comes with that is not all necessarily positive.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to add to your daily count of data center mentions a whole bunch, I think. But before we start talking about data centers directly, I guess I want to talk about data centers indirectly, in the sense that I want to talk about the broader picture of what's going on in the solar and storage markets, which is partially a story of data centers anyway. But we'll attack it head on later. In the meantime, how would you characterize like the state of the market in the U.S. today for utility scale solar and storage?
I mean, I think the state of the market is kind of this weird limbo where, we have this sort of supply side policies of the Biden administration, which are driving growth, growth in American manufacturing in particular, growth in sort of American driven solar and battery storage. But then we've got this enormous demand side, push coming from AI and not just AI, right? I mean, we're talking about the convergence of some other trends, which we can talk about when we talk about data centers, but electrification, decarbonization, advanced manufacturing, all of these things are actually legitimate load drivers as well. So you've got this double dip of supply and demand. But then I would also say that at the same time, these massive macros that are pushing the industry are also both fraught with uncertainty at this moment. So it's a crazy time when we don't know whether our businesses will be 10 times as large or non-existent.
And that's not to mention like the complexity of things like tariffs, which are super dynamic in general, but I'd say particularly so in solar and storage, because it's not just the latest, like what Trump took office and wants to introduce tariffs on X, Y, and Z, which is definitely happening. There was like already an ongoing complexity around tariffs in solar, I guess, especially, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, for Intersect, we've been the sort of, cheerleaders. I've got the pom-poms to show it for American manufacturing for some time. And so we have less risk in this regard. But I've often talked about how it's not just tariffs. It's sort of multiple agencies and parts of the federal government. You've got the Commerce and Trade, you've got DOD and National Defense, all kind of coming at, in particular, the Chinese-sourced equipment for renewable energy. So that's been happening for a while. I don't anticipate it to get any better under Donald Trump. To be quite honest, I've been quite shocked that it hasn't already gotten much worse with some of the day one threats against China. I think, and as someone who has, a pretty robust, almost entirely American supply chain, I guess, whereas under Biden, we would otherwise have gotten the bonus credits in the IRA, I guess I'd be fine with falling back to just having the IRA being, focused on American-made equipment. And I think that's probably where it's headed. So, my hope is that for our company in particular, we won't be that affected, but for the industry at large, it's going to be a big, big problem.
So on the supply-demand balance question, one thing that you and I have talked about before, I can't actually remember if we talked about it on the podcast or not, but is where PPA prices went over the years, right? And there was a time before, I guess, inflation really took hold here in the US, where PPA prices were at record lows. And I think you were the one who was really ringing the bell of like, actually, this is too low. Like we need PPA prices to be a little higher. They have gone higher since then, but that's been coincident with higher interest rates, which raises the cost of capital on projects anyway. So I guess I'm interested in your updated view. Are we in a good steady state for where PPA prices are today? Do they need to go higher? Do they need to go lower? Like what's healthy for the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we have talked in the past, we've got $4 billion of assets that are running right now that are probably less contracted than the average in the marketplace. We've got some open positions in ERCOT. We've got open positions in California. Those cut across different power products from energy to capacity to, the RECs themselves. So we're pretty sophisticated in terms of how we trade and risk manage for an organization of our size. I think that right now we've seen an evolution to longer term contracts because of these price points, right? So, the prices are increasingly in a position where I think they are commensurate with the risk that people are taking. They are rewarding, the entire value chain for what they're doing. I think a lot of why they've gone up, honestly, is because, as you say, the input prices. So you haven't seen, say, developer margins blowing out, right? I think developer margins are probably, more stable than they were before. We can talk a little bit about what developers were taking and what that has resulted in terms of there's for a lot of developers in the marketplace, there's a lot of chaos going on right now. We can talk a little bit about that. But a lot of those people are in that position because they took on some of those lower price contracts and they can't deliver. So I think it hasn't so much been a windfall for developers, but it has stabilized the businesses, made them, more, sustainable, and then also just stabilized sort of the supply chain, particularly the American attributes of the supply chain. It's now possible to build some of this stuff in the U.S.
That's interesting. So am I understanding you right that, okay, so the historical dynamic here was PPA prices back, as the market started to develop, not prices, terms. It was like a 20-year PPA was standard. And then in more recent years, in part, I think, thanks to you or you and a bunch of others, folks started signing shorter tenor PPAs, maybe 10-year PPAs or whatever. And then, as you said, figuring out how to hedge or at least plan around the merchant risk on the tail. This is going to be a project that operates for 25, 30 years. And so you plan around what the value is going to be in the open market after those 10 years. But it sounds like you're saying now it's trending back toward longer term PPAs as prices have risen?
Yeah, I'm not sure that tenors have really expanded beyond the 15. I mean, they sort of collapsed to 15, and we can talk about whether it was folks like us who were going for shorter tenor or not. I see it more like our move to sort of 5-year deals or having a merchant slice that's totally open was almost a response to 15, right? If people are only offering 15, they're really saying, why don't you take a bunch of merchant risk on the way back end of this project, which is exactly when you don't want it, right? So, in fact, the 15 years is kind of part of the problem and kind of part of what we were getting away from. So I don't necessarily see a return to 20-year deals, but it's more just the pricing on the 15 starts to look, commensurate with, something that can give you a reasonable return of capital on a risk-adjusted basis. I will say there's kind of an odd thing going on where spot prices remain quite low, but PPA prices for 15-year deals are kind of floating up. And I think a lot of that's based on the fact that you've got CCAs and corporates and others, they know what their load is. They know how much they can pay and still kind of, make money or, make their customers and ratepayers deliver good rates. And so I think they're just not willing to, they're wanting to take that risk off the table. So they're willing to sign those 15-year deals, even though spot prices today are quite low. So there's a separation there that's a little bit strange right now. And that's been something we've been observing in the market.
Catalyst is brought to you by Energy Hub. Energy Hub helps utilities build next-generation virtual power plants that unlock reliable flexibility at every level of the grid. The Energy Hub platform takes the guesswork out of balancing energy supply and demand. It uses AI-driven optimizations to precisely shape load profiles and dispatch multiple types of customer devices for maximum grid impact. As the industry leader, Energy Hub helps more than 70 utilities manage 1.5 million devices, more than any other edge terms on the market. Click the link in the show notes to learn more, or go to energyhub.com.
Catalyst is brought to you by Antenna Group, the OGs of PR and marketing for climate tech. Is your brand a leader or challenger? Are you looking to win the hearts and minds of customers, partners, or investors? If you're a startup, investor, enterprise, or innovation ecosystem that's helping drive climate's age of adoption, Antenna Group is ready to power your impact. Visit antennagroup.com to learn more.
All right, so you mentioned corporates. Let's dive into data center world. Okay, so the historical norm here was I'm a hyperscaler. I'm Google, Meta, Amazon, whatever. And I build a lot of data centers. I have a lot of electricity demand. I want it to be clean. I build my data centers wherever, basically. And then I sign virtual PPAs for as much of that as I can. And then in more recent years, I try to hourly match those virtual PPAs such that it's as close to an 24/7 time-matched PPA as possible. What I'm finding interesting is this trend that I think you are on the vanguard of here, of this new wave of data centers maybe being co-located with generation. Happening certainly with natural gas as well, but you're pioneering it to some degree, in part through this partnership with TPG and Google that you announced a couple months ago, to co-locate solar and storage with data centers. So I guess that I have a whole bunch of questions about this, but the first one is why co-locate? Like, is it about getting clean power to site? Is it about time to power? Is it about the interconnection woes? Like, what is the reason to co-locate?
I mean, the story of what is necessary in the market for data centers and for all kind of digital and advanced manufacturing loads that are now growing so fast is a story of speed and scale. That's something that at Intersect, we've probably been one of the few providers in the market that's been really rapidly focused on those two things, right? Where can we provide really scalable 500 meg gigawatts scale, plants quickly, and not sort of this kind of, and then a miracle occurs development, right? Where you go in, you plant a seed, you sit on it for 10 years while you wait for a transmission line to get built. That's great. That's if you have the patience and capital to do that, by all means, I think there've been some great success stories there, but I'm not sure that as we move into this next era of power development, that's really the solution set that a lot of these new loads need. So, just maybe backing up to kind of the 50,000 foot view, it's not just data centers, right? We have these kind of three mega trends. Really digitalization. We all know, we can read every single newspaper about AI and e-commerce and everything that is driving data center demand. But then the one that's been intriguing me lately is really electrification. And the electrification of load is not necessarily tied to decarbonization. This is something, I'd actually be fascinated to talk to you about more at length. But we're increasingly seeing, electrification that is because the product is better, right? There are now better and better electric motors. There are better and better, ways to make steel with arc furnaces. There aren't a lot of people building, a lot of this advanced manufacturing with, cogen units on site for thermal energy and things like that. We're moving to an electrified economy, not just because of decarbonization. And then, of course, there's the third trend, which is decarbonization, which no matter what policy environment you're in, it's a real thing. It's a thing over the next few decades of our lives and our careers, and you can't put that down. So between those three things, you've got this huge growth of load that's unprecedented in my career, and then the grid is broken, right? Which is something, to your point, we've been pointing out at Intersect for a long time, which means the load will have to come to generation. So for us, AI data centers are we thought maybe hydrogen would be first because of the supply side supports under the IRA. The demand just didn't materialize. And now all of a sudden AI has just swept up all of the assets that we developed for, behind the meter and co-located load for itself.
But the reason to co-locate, just to isolate it, is the grid is broken thing, as in you are, I guess maybe to put a finer point on it, are you finding sites, or do you expect to find sites where your addition of co-located solar and storage will enable either a data center that couldn't have been sited there otherwise because there isn't enough capacity on the grid, or it could be bigger than it otherwise would have been? Like, this is a mechanism to get things sited.
Yes, there are many of those sites where they can be bigger and get put in the ground faster than if you were to rely purely on a load interconnection to the grid. If you're a grid operator or a local government or a state government, you've got three problems with data centers, right? One, they jump onto your grid and they require you to pay for a bunch of, essentially a load interconnect's a little bit different than a gen interconnect in most jurisdictions, where a lot of the load upgrades are paid for and socialized, right? So they require you to buy a transmission line for a hyperscaler and then everybody pays for it. That's one. Two, do you have enough energy? Most places do. Most places have excess energy at most hours. And 3, do you have enough capacity at the peak moments when the grid is really breaking down on you? Is the data center going to push you over the edge? And so I think, what colocation can do, particularly when you bring either, batteries or to some degree even, I mean, we're working on, gas-fired dispatchable as well. Not combined cycle, that's silly, but simple cycle, combined with renewables. And when you bring all that together, you can answer kind of all 3 of those things, right? The gen interconnect ultimately often pays for the substation and things like that because the generator interconnects usually have to pay for more of that. The energy you've got plenty of behind the meter, and then the battery or the dispatchable load or the solar itself can relieve a lot of the capacity constraint and make it so that you're not contributing any. So from that standpoint, it's the scale of being able to build massive projects. It's the speed of being able to bring renewables online. They're still absolutely the fastest form of generation to bring online in this country and will be for at least 5 or 6 more years. And then it's the speed and scale that also come through getting regulators and local communities to let you do this, right? Because that, I think, is a huge hang-up. We haven't even begun to look at the hang-up that is for brand new CCGTs and nukes and other things. But it's already a hang-up for renewables. So why wouldn't it be a massive hang-up for those?
So obviously the extreme version of what you're describing is an off-grid data center, which has been much discussed but not really done. What you're describing right now is grid connected, right? Do you think that's a stepping stone? Like ultimately this stuff should be off grid? Do you think ultimately that makes no sense whatsoever? Everything should always be grid connected? Is there some nuance to what the answer is situationally?
I think it's all about if it makes sense for the grid in a lot of ways, right? If the grid in that location has some excess energy and they want to share it with the data center from time to time because, hey, making money out of something that was otherwise making nothing is good for ratepayers, or if they want to be in a position where, potentially in an emergency, they can rely on the data center's battery capacity or dispatchable gas that's behind the meter, then, grid connection makes all the sense in the world. But generally speaking, I think we're moving into an era where grid connection is optional and should be optional. And that, we should be able to, operate these things fully off-grid if necessary. Now, I will tell you that a lot of customers still very much want the grid optionality, right? So they're gonna continue to, even if they go down the road of an off-grid data center, try to pursue having the grid eventually come to that site just for insurance purposes. But increasingly, what we're developing for is an overlay with the gas grid as well as the power grid. So I'll give you an example. We've got 2 multi-gigawatt scale data center sites in the panhandle of Texas. One of them is 3 gigawatts. One of them is over 1 gigawatt, single sites. And they're capable of being fully off-grid if you want them to. They're on gas. They have, multiple gigawatts each of wind and solar on site. The ability to interconnect batteries for similar capacities. But they also have interconnection to the grid. So there's sort of this energy Disneyland that can be all things to all people. But fundamentally, if you wanted to sever from the grid, you could.
So operationally, for the ones, the initial projects that you're developing in this mold where they are grid connected, is the idea that the vast majority of the time the thing is operating, or at least the behind the meter generation is delivering all of the power that the site needs and it's pulling from the grid occasionally? Is it more dynamic than that? And like you have 60% capacity factor between your renewables and your storage. And so 40% of the time, averaged out across days, the data center is pulling from the grid. Like what do you think it looks like? What's the optimal? I mean, it's a question really, it's an economic question, right? Like you could overbuild to infinity on the solar and wind and storage side. And then of course you have enough energy, but sort of an optimal economic question, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what a lot of the folks that are sort of making this holy war between, gas, renewables, nuclear, don't understand is that there is a baseload solution that's like, a little bit of a gassy renewables solution, if you will, where it's like, you can go into the panhandle of Texas, which is where these monster projects that we have are, and you can find yourself spots where you've got high 70% capacity factors of renewables. So, 75 to 80% of the hours of the year, we can run fully carbon free with, wind, solar, and batteries all on the same site. And then, 20%, maybe a little over 20% of the time, we need to have some gas or we need to use the grid. That is, the interesting thing about that is probably akin to the cleanest possible mix of renewables maybe anywhere in the country other than California and Hawaii, right? So you're talking about, when people say, oh, these data centers are bringing back coal or whatever, like there are opportunities to actually make these data centers some of the most, sort of clean powered industrial loads in the country, and to do it at costs that are actually probably the most competitive. If you go build a CCGT right now for $2,000 kW and, you can't even find sort of labor unions and pipe fitters and whatnot that have ever even built these things in many cases, right? It's going to take 5-6 years and the first ones ain't going to be cheap. I would put renewables and, 12 heat rate recip engines for 20% of the time in against those CCGTs on cost all day. And we're effectively baseload as well. So I think that's what's being missed when people are like baseload resources, the only way to do that is gas. Well, yeah, we need some gas, but just not the gas people are saying that we need.
Have you seen any appetite for flexible load from these data centers? The other thing that people talk about a lot, but I've seen no evidence of it actually in action, of basically operating the data center anything other than 24/7. Is there any interest in doing that, whether for economic reasons, because you can offer lower, electricity prices, or emissions reasons? It doesn't really matter. Is anybody talking about actually doing that?
So while power might be increasingly sort of sexy at cocktail parties because of AI, some things don't change. And one of those things is that we are still the tail of the dog, right? And we're not wagging anything. So when you think about the capacity factors on the capex themselves, right? Like let's just take a gigawatt data center, and I'm going to round to the nearest, whatever. $2.5 billion. Okay, so let's just say you've got a gigawatt data center like the one I described that has wind, solar, batteries, some gas, and that generation, maybe $5-6 billion of power assets. The data center itself, powered shell, maybe another $2.5 billion. Built to suit takes you to $10 billion on the data center. So that's $10 billion structure. $5 to $6 billion of renewable or power assets, and then $30 billion of chips. So every second you aren't running that at 100% capacity factor is enormous amortized cost, right? So that it's one of those things where it's like you'd be a fool to turn it down. You have to at some points, because operationally, there are things that you got to do for maintenance or, changing the way you're, running your model or whatever it is that constrains the data center operation itself. But because the power grid is too expensive, no, never.
You mentioned time to power as being one of the advantages of building renewables in part, but in general, it's the term of art in this industry at the moment, certainly as it pertains to the intersection of data centers and power. What are you seeing there? Is there a willingness to pay more? How much additional flexibility do you get if you can offer power in 2 years versus 5, or 5 years versus 10?
I think it depends on who you're talking to. Up until about maybe 9-12 months ago, no one wanted to even talk about anything beyond kind of like the prompt year, maybe 18 months out, right? Everybody was just so desperate for something right now. I think a combination of, one, they started to make some bigger bets and build a little inventory, and two, just the fact that they're starting to realize that it's not out there. People have begun to capitulate. So for instance, for us, we announced as part of the Google deal that we would be bringing online a very, very sizable data center in 26. So, to be quite honest, that's sort of unheard of, right? And that data center is going to have a co-location element to it. So, while you might have Stargate with its first phase coming on out there, in Abilene or wherever it is that can come on quickly, that's most of even the big stuff is load served from the grid right now. So I think our projects will be some of the first, very, very large scale, co-located assets. And the first of them will be 26. And then those monster 3 gigawatt and 1 gigawatt systems out in the panhandle, the first gigawatt scale phases of those can come on by end of 27, early 28. So we are sitting on some stuff that could come on very, very rapidly. But a lot of that's because of the work we did on kind of how we interconnect our hydrogen loads. So we have some pretty bespoke interconnection configurations, both technically and commercially, that others I think are going to look. It's not rocket science. People figure it out. You get enough regulatory attorneys and smart commercial people, you'll get there. But I think we're a ways ahead of a lot of folks, and that's a lot of what will dictate speed to power.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a flip side of another thing that I've noticed, which is there's certain groups that have benefited from, it's not exactly luck, but they were working on something else and then happened upon a gold mine, basically, when this happened. So in your case, it is you were developing megasites for hydrogen production. And because you were already developing those megasites, you had a step ahead of everybody else when it turned out that we need a gigawatt or 3 gigawatts at a single location to build data centers. The flip side of that were the Bitcoin miners who were building, sites that were load sites, and they were the ones who were early to looking for large capacity on the grid that you could site a data center at. And so this is where, Crusoe is a good example of this, speaking of the Abilene data center, right? Like they were developing data centers for Bitcoin mining and they had sites, and it turns out that's the coin of the realm at the moment. And so now you get to flip from being a Bitcoin miner to being an AI data center developer, and you're a step ahead. So it's, a matter of being in the right place at the right time, I suppose.
Yeah, you're and not only are you now exciting at parties, but you're also more socially acceptable somehow. That's not true actually. With crypto now, I think we've released the stigma in the new administration. Yeah. We're back. But yeah, look, we've been talking to folks on the crypto side for a long time. We were actually looking at a crypto deal that was frankly nixed by one of our banks years ago. And all of our interactions with the crypto folks, almost universally, I'd say, that the reputable players in the space are some of the smartest and most creative people I've found in the power market. So, we I think share a lot of DNA. They're entrepreneurial. They're developers like we are. They understand the rules, but they also see the rules as things to find creative ways to work within, and so yeah, I would definitely look. The last thing we are is going to sit here and tell you that we knew exactly what was going to happen. I do think that if you look at what we were writing and saying, hydrogen was the first of many things we were preparing for. I think the thesis that
you talked about direct air capture and yeah, I remember.
The thesis that the grid is broken and that, in the case of what I've written in the past, climate loads in particular, clean steel, direct air capture, all of these things, if we were going to proceed with the climate policies of the prior administration or the path it looked like we were going down, would require enormous amounts of kind of co-located generation. That thesis proved to be durable just, I think, because it was based on some pretty basic insight. Somebody asked me the other day a similar version of this question, which was like, "Oh, it looks like you guys were pretty prescient on the behind the meter co-located stuff." And I said, no, really all it is we just decided that a miracle wasn't going to happen, and then did the most obvious thing you could, right? And so if deciding that you don't believe in miracles is the prescient thing, then I guess that's what we are. But one last comment, maybe it's karma too, Shayle, because we were in that heavy fist fight with a lot of people in the industry about whether or not hydrogen should be co-located and time matched. And, and a lot of people wanted to, we could have just as easily developed it on the ship channel with, VPPAs from West Texas, and we didn't. And yeah, now we are benefiting from how we chose to develop it. So, maybe there's a little karma in the world.
You're getting paid in a different way.
Yeah.
Has there been, so we're recording this, like 3 weeks past the public market meltdown of DeepSeek. Have you felt any impact whatsoever on market demand for large scale centralized data centers since then? Or was it a brief public market overreaction? Jevons paradox immediately took hold and we're right back where we were.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of amazes me how little, sort of critical thinking there is in the flow of, hundreds of billions of dollars in our economy, right? I mean, like, it's the first question I had was like, is this even real, right? And turns out it kind of isn't. Like,
seems real.
Well,
DeepSeek, you're saying?
Yeah, DeepSeek. I mean, it's a distilled model, right? I mean, like, so great. You can make an energy efficient model as long as the totally not energy inefficient version of it came before. So distillation is a real thing. I'm not an engineer in AI, but like, the whole strategy of Apple, for instance, when I've sat with folks from Apple on the AI side, is basically distillation. We'll take very powerful models, we'll distill them down by sort of like effectively kind of, generalizing the nodes to make them almost as intelligent, but not quite. And then we'll just do inference locally. And that's kind of how we'll play the game on lower power equipment. So there's that first, right? I think people have to understand that a model is not a model is not a model. Again, I'm not an engineer, but the engineers I've talked to since the DeepSeek announcement have made that pretty clear to me. Secondly, like, here's China, right? China is an economy that is locked in a sort of mortal battle with the United States over AI dominance. Its incentive is it's got to put out a model, right? It needs a public relations win that says it has a model that's as powerful as ChatGPT, Gemini, et cetera, right? But it also can't tell the world that the United States chip embargo is completely toothless and isn't doing anything. So kind of course, the press release is, yeah, we have a model. It's as powerful and it doesn't use any chips, so I guess that's the first place I go, which is just like, it feels a little bit like BS to me, but let's just take it at its face value though, that it is real. The fundamental question I have is awesome. So, what that means is that every megawatt hour of power can produce more intelligence. I don't understand why you would use less now, right? Jevons paradox.
That's the Jevons paradox, right?
Is there some reason why this model is very efficient and also can't be made smarter by putting more power into it? Because if that's true, yeah, then we have a problem. But like, it's not.
I think the narrative has quickly turned back to a Jevons paradox story of like, great, this is more efficient, we're going to use more of it, or we're going to use the same amount of it and get more out of it, I guess is a better way to put it. The only counter argument to that I see, and it's not really a great micro argument, but it is a macro historical one, is what happened with power use efficiency in data centers over the past 20 years, pre-AI, where efficiency just kept improving such that the overall power load of compute stayed relatively flat, despite the fact that we did do a whole lot more compute as we were shifting to the cloud. So like that was happening. And we sort of generally believe this time around is different. We are going to see significantly more power demand from compute, largely from AI now. And so we're going to break this cycle of efficiency equating to load growth, or I guess equating to demand growth for compute over time. And so I think that is what you have to believe. Everyone seems to believe it, with a few exceptions. But it does stand to reason to me that, look, the first major, let's just, again, to your point, like let's assume DeepSeek is real at face value, that the first big efficiency step function improvement and these models is immediately should immediately decrease our forecast for electricity load growth. Like all of a sudden we're gonna, we had already found the ceiling, and so now the ceiling is just lower. That seems unlikely to me.
Yeah, I think first of all, we should have like a source off on the kind of like did data center load flatten, because we were, even 4 years ago when we were looking at kind of like load growth for the original like nexus of deep decarbonization articles and things that I wrote, like you were still seeing data center load growth just purely for like e-commerce and basic machine learning and things that were, pretty significant, way more significant than, electricity load growth in any other sector. So, easily double digit, kind of load growth. So I think on a very substantial base, right? So anyway, so I do think that there's that we have, it never really flattened out. But I think the other thing to keep in mind is like, what was that low growth fueling, right? A lot of that was commerce, e-commerce, web traffic. And I think a better analogy is to look at storage instead of compute, right? Storage is something that just goes, like we seem to have an unbridled thirst for how much we want to store. And, a lot of it's garbage, but a lot of it gets stored, right? And so I do think that there are, like, AI may scale more like that. The reasons for that are a couple things. Commerce and the internet are limited by the number of people that have access to the internet, right? So when people looked at like, how does the internet economy scale, whether it's fiber or data centers or Google's, revenue for ads, they always looked at like, how many people have access to the internet, right? That was like a big statistic for a long time. And, when Africa gets access to the internet, it's going to be bonkers, right? Well, yeah, but now we're talking about something that creates load recursively, Shayle. That's the thing, right? So Apple is trying to convince me that they don't need a data center strategy or a big model AI strategy, primarily because they don't have one, I don't think. And look, I'm not throwing rocks. They probably have a lot, but the reality is that they're telling me, look, our strength is, put the smaller LLM on the phone. But the problem with that is that the smaller LLM on the phone is built to only do a couple things. It'll like check the weather, it'll listen to you and hear your words and understand you better. But then it's going to launch 1,000 ships, right? Every smaller distilled LLM that is power efficient doing inference is going to launch thousands of queries to bigger, more capable models that can actually reason their way through buying something on Amazon and reason. So it's almost like increasing the world's population by billions of people who all will want to browse the web and engage in e-commerce transactions. So, forget when Africa finds the internet. When the machines find the internet, they will be its biggest user by orders of magnitude. And so that's really where I think, in the early days of AI, 2 years ago, in the early days of the hype, there was this like, wow, you as a power guy should be thinking about training only because it's the only way that anybody's going to put a big data center like that in place. I think now what we're seeing is that inference in the aggregate is actually probably a much larger draw than the training in the long run.
When machines find the internet it's like hard for me not to have Skynet in my head as you say that, but it does evoke a strong image. All right, man. I know you have to catch a flight. This was illuminating and interesting as always. I'm super excited to see you put like massive co-located data centers with renewables online in the next, I guess, year and a half or something, if you're going to get something online in 2026. So it seems like you've got to get to work.
Yeah. We're in the middle of project financing about $9 billion of CapEx right now. And next year, if we sign these two deals we're negotiating, will probably be bigger. So it's a terrifying but also exciting time. So thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, appreciate it. Sheldon Kimber is the CEO and founder of Intersect Power. This show is a production of Latitude Media. You can head over to latitudemedia.com for links to today's topics. Latitude is supported by Prelude Ventures. Prelude backs visionaries accelerating climate innovation that will reshape the global economy for the betterment of people and planet. Learn more at preludeventures.com. This episode was produced by Daniel Woldorff. Mixing by Roy Campanella and Sean Marquand. Theme song by Sean Marquand. Stephen Lacey is our executive editor. I'm Shayle Kann, and this is Catalyst.